All right, so let's talk about how about and we'll kind of transition here where it's not so much the RB dead zone, although it's hard to really classify what exactly is the RB dead zone. But let's talk about, since we're kind of talking about like a committee backfield where
Yep.
we have some of these guys, Tony Pollard, Tajay Spears, Najee Harris, Jalen Warren. How do you feel about the Cincinnati backfield and a guy like Zach Moss and Chase Brown? Which one do you prefer? And maybe even both, because honestly, they're not that expensive. Sometimes Zach Moss kind of falls into the 8th round, so it's not too bad to really acquire both of these. Or is there a guy that you prefer over the other?
I think you'd have to draft him for two different reasons, right? Like, so I think the safer option, obviously, is Zach Moss. He's going to have the workload, I think, coming in, and Chase Brown is the upside, right? I prefer Zach Moss because we saw what he did with starters touches in Indy, and it was phenomenal, right? Like, and he can catch the rock. He can be the only back if needed. They can lean on him. He can play the mixing role, I think, really well. Whereas even if Chase Brown got the full workload, I'm not sure that we would see the level of production that we'd want to see. It kind of reminds me of like a Najee Harris and Chase Brown. I think there's a similar theme going on here with a lot of teams' backfields. So for me, I'm going to take the guy that I think is going to get the most touches from day one and kind of leave the ambiguity out of it, right? Like if Chase Brown pops, he's going to pop on somebody else's team, or maybe it's a little bit later on in the draft. But if I can get Zach Moss as my RB3 in case of injury, in case he is the starter and he's getting a lot of the workload in the red zone, for me, that matters versus like hoping out that Chase Brown takes over week 5, week 6. The only way I would say I would take Chase Brown in this instance over Zach Moss is if somehow getting close to the season, we heard the words 50-50 split, or we heard Chase Brown was a starter. That's it. If Zach Moss is getting 15 to 20 touches, carries a game, I'll say, to me, it's no question. I'll get the safer option.
And that'll be interesting. These are always interesting to wait for like training camp to kind of see
Yeah.
how the words playing out. And that's what you don't want to listen to training camp hype about this guy or this guy. The most important thing in training camp are these ambiguous backfields that we're not quite sure how it's going to play out, and seeing who's getting the first team touches and that kind of stuff. Although I will say, last year DeAndre Swift was not getting first team touches, and he ended up overtaking that back.
Well, Kenny Gainwell got hurt, and so that's
it
sometimes
opened the door, and that's what we could have here. This is why, for me, once again, like we talked about Tony Pollard, Tajay Spears, I'd rather just take the guy who's going a little bit later. Now, I will say how I anticipate this backfield playing is kind of what I just mentioned. How once training camp happens, we're definitely going to get word at who's getting first team touches. And whoever that player is, they're going to fly. Like, I don't want to say necessarily fly up the board, but move up the board quite a bit. And I think Zach Moss, I would not be shocked. I'll say this. I don't think that there's ever going to be a true workhorse in this backfield. I think it's always going to be kind of split, and both these guys are going to get work. Now, where I can see Zach Moss like seeing more work than Chase Brown is more maybe in the receiving game, possibly if he's the better, pass blocker in pass pro. Also in the red zone, I think Zach Moss could probably be more the goal line back here compared to Chase Brown. But we'll have to see how training camp's going out. And I also think he'll move up the draft board. But right now, I really do like Chase Brown, sometimes even going in late 10th round. I love that because what we have, and I know we just talked about efficiency, but last year, Chase Brown was uber efficient on the touches that he got. Now, it wasn't that many, but we saw big explosive plays. He was honestly really productive in college. And he was kind of like he's like, we're getting out of it now, but the COVID year of college just messed up a lot of these guys and how you would really look at these guys. And he was a big player that was affected by the COVID years and stayed in college a little bit too long, but he goes to a really good situation. And another thing is I really wouldn't mind even drafting both of them at their current ADP just because they are going later, and say Zach Moss ends up just overtaking the backfield and he's a bell cow. I mean, that's a guy who's probably going to be a back in RB1 in fantasy football and one of the best offenses in the NFL. Or if Chase Brown ends up overtaking the backfield, he's another guy who's probably going to be an RB1 in fantasy football. And just at their current price, it just makes, I don't mind it. I hate taking running backs on the same team. I really do. But this is a backfield that if a guy overtakes the other one, he's going to be incredibly valuable in fantasy football.
Well, you make some really good points there, dude. Like, because if Chase Brown hits, it can make your team, right? Like, obviously, there's a chance that. So this is a big risk reward play that you're not having to really pay a whole lot for.
Yeah.
It's just if he's not good, if he's not overtaking Zach Moss at any point, he's probably going to be a roster clog. So for me, I look at it as like if you've already drafted a lot of your starting lineup, which by the time Chase Brown goes, you already have. if that looks very secure and safe, if you have a lot of like, we kind of know what to expect guys in your lineup, then Chase Brown can be the upside that you get later on. You know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
that's also another thing too, is with these, ambiguous backfields, you got to know what you drafted. If you drafted a bunch of rookies, you might want to lean on a guy like Zach Moss so that you
Yeah.
have a little bit of balance safety wise in case one of them misses, and vice versa. If you got a bunch of locked in starters, people you're never taking out of your lineup because you know for a fact they're going to hit, get Chase Brown later.
Mhm. No, I agree 100%. So let's look at another one it's interesting. Now, it's not I don't know how good this offense is gonna be, and that's Washington, and we're looking at Brian Thomas and Austin Ekeler. I don't know how good this offense is gonna be.
Brian
Or
Robinson,
Brian. Yeah, who did I say?
Brian Thomas.
Oh, Brian. Well, he does go in that range. I do like
Yes.
I
Yeah.
don't mind him in that range. But we have Brian Robinson. Yes, Brian Robinson. So we have this backfield here. We have Austin Ekeler, obviously has had great fantasy success over the past really like 4 or 5 years now. Last year, he did get hurt. I think that definitely affected him. He had the high ankle sprain, but he is getting up there in age, not the biggest back. So um how do you feel about this backfield? What are you doing currently? Is there it could even be a backfield that you're just not that interested in. But if there's a guy, who do you prefer?
They go kind of similarly, right? Like
Yeah.
around the similar range, like a round or two
You
apart.
gotta take one of them because you can't really get both of them. They do go it's hard to get both of them. So you gotta
Yeah,
take
I
one.
find myself like doing mocks so far. I find myself like attached to the value that Brian Robinson had last year. And I think, okay, like Brian Robinson. But the more I think about it, the more I think that like Eckler's probably going to be the better value, in my opinion, right? Like I think the straight sure shot is Brian Robinson. But Eckler is like, he was dealing with a high ankle last year. And a lot of people who play football or anybody that's watched football for an extensive period of time knows high ankle is basically
No
tearing your
joke.
ankle. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're not yourself for 8 weeks, and we see the clips of him running hella slow, right? It looked like he was going in,
Yeah.
running in mud. But Eckler as a pass catcher is legit. And we talk about a rookie quarterback. A rookie quarterback's best friend, running backs out the backfield and tight ends. And Austin Eckler, as a veteran and as somebody who can catch the pass, who can receive out the backfield, if he's somewhere around the 150 to 200 touch marker, that's a very good season, an RB2 type season potentially for Austin Eckler. So I know it's easy to look at what he did last year with the Chargers and think, oh, this guy's just washed up, he's slow. But if there's any ounce of juice left, I mean, this is a former All-Pro running back that we're talking about. He's not a slouch. So to get him outside of the top, 25, maybe even outside of the top 30 RBs, depending on your league, I think there's some good value there as opposed to like Brian Robinson. We kind of know what to expect with that guy.
Yeah. And I'll say this, I'm no pro athlete. All right. No pro athlete, but I did have a high ankle sprain in college. And I gotta say that was one of the worst
Oh,
injuries
bro.
I've ever had. They're no joke. And it
Barely
takes a
walk.
long time to get back to normal. Even though it's 8 weeks, like you're still not yourself in those
Yeah.
for a while after that. So no, I agree with you in that sense that he was dealing with the injury. It's just really, I will say this. If there's a guy that I prefer, I'd rather just go with Brian Robinson. And the reason why is just because I think he's going to be the goal line back. I feel good about that he'll be used more around the red zone. Because the other thing is, yes, you probably will have Austin Eckler be the receiving back on this offense. Like that's probably what he was brought here. But we have a rookie quarterback, but we have a mobile rookie quarterback. And what we see with mobile quarterbacks is they just don't check the ball down at a very high rate compared to, your standard pocket passing quarterbacks. So that's kind of like the issue for me is that, yes, there's value in receiving backs, but also like how many receptions is it truly going to be with a guy who's a mobile quarterback? So like for me, I just rather take that younger guy, Brian Robinson, who had a pretty solid season last year. And he's, like you said, basically going around the same price. So if I'm going to take a guy in that range, I'd rather just take Brian Robinson because I feel good about the touchdowns. I feel like he's going to be the goal line back compared to Austin Eckler. So if I'm going to take a shot on one, I'd prefer Brian
See,
Robinson.
say that safety, and we kind of flip flopped on like the safety versus risk reward. It seems like with the risk reward with the older players, it's tough because you're going a lot off like pedigree and you're going off past
Yeah.
production, right? And I feel like Eckler can do that. The one thing I'll also say too is for those who like to trade, whoever's watching this, and you got leagues that you like to trade, if Eckler at any point in time has a 15 to 20 point game, oh boy, that trade value skyrockets now.
Just because the
Now
name.
Austin Eckler is back, especially
Right.
if it happens in the first 2-3 weeks of the season.
and you can maybe get off. And one last thing I'll say too is, and this is kind of alluding back to your point earlier where you're talking about efficiency and how it's a bit overrated. Austin Eckler was incredibly inefficient last year, but once again, you got to put things in context. Is it efficient? Because he is getting up there in age. I think he's going to be
Yep.
29 this season. He's
Yep.
an older running back, but he was dealing with a high ankle sprain. So how much was that truly affecting the efficiency where he wasn't that efficient compared to years past? So it's one of those things where maybe the end is near and it could be this year, possibly next year, but he was dealing with a high ankle sprain.